Hi everybody, I'm Vivekanand Pandey Vimal. I'm a research scientist and I'm in this place called the Ashton Graybiel Spatial Orientation Lab. That's in Brandeis University. It's in Waltham, Massachusetts. And if any of you are around, you're more than welcome to come. And this picture of me wearing these like really nice snake pants are with the two directors of the lab, Paul Dizio and James Lackner. And then, as Rahul said, the majority of this has been funded through the NASA Human Research Program, so thanks to them for that. Just to give you like an overview of the lab in case any of you guys want to collaborate or explore when you come. We have a rotating... This... I see. Okay, and I'll also... Okay, great. Yeah, so we have a rotating room here, and that's used to study artificial gravity. We have force plates, we have spinning devices, we have a Stewart platform. And then in addition to what I'll present today, the lab studies motion sickness, postural stabilization. We've done like astronaut training before, and then before my time they were doing parabolic flights and things like that. Most of what I'll present today is going to be from this paper. It's a freshly birthed study that I did, just a few weeks old. And it's called The Effect of Vibrotactile Feedback on Performance, Perception, Trust when Balancing in Different Analog G levels. So it's open access. So the general storyline I like to start with is that imagine that you are an astronaut and you're on your way, you're going to the moon or to Mars. What we know is that astronauts will become very susceptible to something known as spatial disorientation. And spatial disorientation is something I'll be talking about a lot in this presentation. All it really means is when a pilot or astronaut loses sense of their orientation. They lose sense of, which way they're pointed, even in some cases where up is. And you could imagine that this could be extremely, extremely dangerous. And typically, these spatial disorientation incidences will be heightened during gravitational transitions, such as going from 0G and then trying to land on the surface of a planet or the moon. Like during any sort of flight, especially a long duration flight, there's something known as sensory reweighting, and all that really means is that the vestibular system, which is in your inner ear, I'll talk more about that in a few moments, but that'll change. You'll get used to 0G, you'll adapt to it, and then all of a sudden when you have to land, your vestibular system won't be ready to deal with like these new gravitational cues, and this can lead to a lot of problems. Also, during space exploration, there are going to be a whole bunch of different stressors, psychological stressors, physiological stressors. All of these will heighten disorientation. And then not to mention, even if you adapt to the changing gravitational fields and you're on the surface of Mars or Moon, this is really going to be what my presentation is about today. Even if you're adapted on the surface, the gravitational cues are less than they are on Earth. And this is going to cause problems for astronauts and pilots and things like that. And again, just to highlight what a big deal this is, forget space exploration. Here on Earth, one of the leading causes of fatal aircraft accidents is spatial disorientation in pilots. So we're going to have three different topics I'm going to try to run through and talk about today. The first is, how does performance in this task that I'll describe change as the G level decreases, as you go from Earth to Martian, to lunar, to 0G. And then the second question is, how can human augmentation help? And human augmentation is this idea of taking technology, putting it onto the human to enhance our senses, and then seeing, does it really enhance? Can we perform better? And the type of human augmentation I'll look at is vibrotactile feedback, using little vibrators that you put on the skin. Again, I'll talk about all this in a second. And then the third one is going to be, does extended practice in 0G, Lunar-g analog conditions help? And I'll explain why I'm exploring this when we get to it. So first, I'll begin by just explaining how do I create these analog conditions here on Earth. So we're not in the analog like the partial G analogs yet. I call this my Earth analog. I strap living human beings into this device. In this case, I'm sporting I do a little bit of fashion on the side, and nothing sellable. This is just like ridiculous fashion. But these are my predator prey pants that I designed and my mother sewed. So in any case, I strap living human beings into this device, and it's programmed like an inverted pendulum. And all that means, as you can see here, is if you do nothing, it just falls over to one side or the other. And then there are crash boundaries. So this is about 60 degrees to either side. And if you're going too far, the machine will stop you. We call that a crash. It will automatically reset you to that center point, and then this trial resumes. And what participants are told to do is grasp that joystick and, to the best of their ability, stabilize themselves right at that center balance point. And you can see here that, I'm blindfolded. So in terms of sensory information that I'm receiving, there's no visual information. One of the motivations for this is that pilots typically get disoriented when they're flying through clouds or at night. So that's why we're blindfolding them, to really heighten their dependence on the vestibular system. So again, most of the information they're getting through the vestibular system, to a secondary extent, like the touch receptors on their skin as they're pushing against this machine. Now, let me provide a quick introduction into the vestibular system, because this is important for understanding the little trick that I use to create these analog conditions. So, to do that, we can take a magic school bus ride right into the inner ear. And that's where the vestibular system resides. The vestibular system has two parts to it. The first are your semicircular canals. They detect angular acceleration during rotations. You get motion cues. And then the second one are the otolith organs. These are fine little hairs. They're adorned by crystals, and they detect linear acceleration. And really, the type of linear acceleration that's most useful for this presentation is that they detect tilt from gravitational vertical. The more you tilt away from gravitational vertical, gravity is pulling on those little crystals, deflecting those hairs, and so you can use the deflection of those hairs to get a good sense of how far away you are from gravitational vertical. So let me summarize this condition, the Earth analog condition, which I sometimes also call the upright condition. Here you have a pretty good sense of where you are from the balance point. The further you get from the balance point, the more those otolith hairs deflect. We call these gravitational cues because the otolith is detecting tilt from gravitational vertical. Okay, so you know where you are here. And in my second condition, I call this my 0G. You could call it the microgravity analog condition. I put people on their back. Now all the dynamics are exactly the same. You do nothing, the machine is just programmed to kind of fall to the left or right, and your objective is to just stabilize yourself right at that center point. So why is it that this is called the 0G analog condition? Well, if you remember, in the upright, the further you got from the balance points, the more those hairs deflected because you're tilting away from gravity, so you knew where you were. But on the back, gravity is just pulling those hairs back. Just saying, hey, you're on your back. And you could be at the balance point, you could be really far away. The hairs still are just saying you're on your back because gravity is no longer tilting them relative to the balance point. So now you can no longer use gravitational cues to determine where you are in space. And as a result, we call this a 0G condition, because in 0G, astronauts will not have a good sense of gravitational cues to determine their orientation. And so that's the trick, Again, this is important. In upright, because you're tilting away from gravitational vertical, you can use that as a reference point. You always know where up is and how far away you are. But on your back, you can't use that to figure out where the balance point is. So right now what I've shown you here on the top is the Earth analog condition in the upright, and on the bottom is the 0G analog condition where someone is on their back. But now what I can do is I can pitch people by 68 degrees. So they're just kind of pitched back, and I'll show you a video of this, balancing 68 degrees pitched back. And what this does is it gives you some gravitational cues, similar to as if you were on the surface of Mars, but not full gravitational cues. And I can do another thing, which is pitch people back even more by 80 degrees. And now this is a lunar analog. You'll get the amount of gravitational cues as if you're on the surface of the moon. So this is essentially how I'm creating these analog conditions. Let me show you a video. This is Earth analog. I'm tilting the person back to the Martian analog. And you can see now that in this plane, you try to balance and your gravitational cues will be diminished. And then in a second, you'll see me tilt further back into the lunar condition. And now I'm balancing in this lunar analog condition. So the experiment I'm going to describe today, there'll be two of them. This is the first one. Is I put people on this machine in the Earth condition in upright for 8 trials. It's about 100 seconds per trial. And this first 8 trials. People are just learning how to balance this thing. It's kind of an intense, beastly machine. It's a little bit scary at times, but people learn, and by 8 trials, most people can kind of balance it. And then the next 3 blocks in randomized order, they experience an Earth, Martian, Lunar, and 0-g analog condition, just to see how they perform in each of these. The last thing I need to tell you before we look at the results is that one group it was the control group, they got no vibrotactile feedback. And a second group, who went through the exact same thing that you saw in the previous slide, got vibrotactile feedback. So vibrotactors, this is an example of like a C2 vibrotactor. This is what I use. And it essentially just vibrates on your skin. And the motivation for using vibrotactors as a potential sensory augmentation aid was that there's a lot of research already done looking at vibrotactors. People have done it in helicopter flight, airplane flight. They've even gone up to the International Space Station to see if astronauts could get a better sense of their orientation. So there's a lot of examples of use in the literature that this is useful. No one's done it in a disorienting, dynamic balancing case like I did. But they've definitely established that this is important. The other reason why I did this was that the NASA Human Research Program roadmap gaps. When you're writing grants to NASA, they say that these are the things that we want you to try to figure out. And they put vibrotactile feedback in there. One motivation for this was that astronauts, pilots are very visually saturated. They have a lot of things that they have to attend to. And same with, their auditory system, because they're hearing things through their headsets. So one of the ideas was that if you can send that same information that they may see on their meters through their skin, maybe that information can be processed in parallel. And so that was one of the ideas and reasons for choosing tactile cueing. So the way that my participants got vibrotactile feedback is they had 4 of these vibrotactors on each of their arms. So in this case, when the participant tilts by 1 degree to the right, let's just say, then on the right side, up by their shoulder, they'll feel a vibration. By the time they reach 7 degrees, they'll feel a vibration a little bit lower down. By 15 degrees, like right by the elbow, on the forearm, and then by 31 degrees by their wrist. So you can imagine that as you're moving in this machine, you can feel the vibrations go down your arm. So this is how you can use it to figure out where you are. Okay, so time for some results. So the x-axis here are the different G levels. And the way I like to read this is I go from right to left. So on the right, you have 1G, and I put a little Earth here to make some of you nostalgic. And then as you go to the left, we've got the Mars and Lunar and 0-g conditions. And in this y-axis, I have the standard deviation of angular position. So, again, this is just how much variability around the balance point. The less, the better, because it means that you're really balancing close to it. So in the Earth, there's very little, variability. By the time you get to Martian, this is a significant difference through a t-test. That's all in the paper if you want to check out the stats. But it's pretty, there's already a significant change happening by Martian-g. And then of course, as you get lower and lower G, their performance just gets worse and worse. Again, I want you guys to emotionally imagine this. By the time you're in 0-g, people are in like a purgatory that they can't escape from. Some people are just like, get me out of this. But it's hard to control it. You're just crashing. So this is the control group. This is people who don't have vibrotactile feedback. Once you do put vibrotactors on the second group, you can see that their performance is significantly better. It becomes significantly better by Martian. And then Lunar and 0-g, they're performing a lot better. The lower the G gets, the more useful the vibrotactile feedback is. So one concluding point here is that vibrotactile feedback as a sensory augmentation, as a human augmentation to enhance performance, is doing a good job. And this is a pretty minimal level of exposure. They only got 8 trials of training beforehand, and it's working out. But what you'll also notice is that the vibrotactile feedback doesn't bring them back to Earth level, and that I'll talk about in a second. Now, what I just showed you was performance, but I also want to know disorientation. Is there a way I can gauge or measure when a person is disoriented? And just as a quick general point, motion sickness and disorientation are 2 different things. Often they come together, but motion sickness is like, oh, I'm feeling sick, I'm going to vomit, and disorientation is, I don't really know where I am in space. And in my experiments, people don't get motion sick. They just get disoriented. So let me show you something that disoriented people in my task characteristically do. In the Earth analog condition, where they're not disoriented, this black line is their angular position. Here it's going a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left. They're all within 10 degrees, doing a great job just balancing back and forth. And then in the spaceflight analog, these partial G conditions, people begin to do something very bizarre. Okay, they may start off at 0, but then they begin to oscillate away. But here, this is just very unusual. At 20 degrees, this person is just oscillating back and forth as if they're at 0 degrees. And I've published different papers, and in a different paper, I find that these types of oscillations, people actually believe they're at the 0 degree point, but of course they're not. And they'll get further and further away. They'll drift further and further away until they hit that crash boundary. Bam! And then people will be like, oh, I had no idea I was so far away. It's very surreal. The other thing I didn't mention is that in the 0G condition, for example, all sorts of bizarre illusions happen. Like, they're on their back. People are like, oh, I feel like I'm completely upside down, or I'm doing crazy 360s. So I just want to highlight that disorientation is a weird and bizarre beast. And there are huge individual differences. People get really confusing, uncharacterized illusions as the brain panics to try to recreate reality when they no longer have a reliable gravitational cue. So in any case, I can measure this drift. And here is a graph showing, again, the control group has huge amount of positional drift, especially as they get to 0G. The vibrotactile group reduces that drift significantly, which is great, but they still exhibit the drifting pattern, showing that there's still elements of disorientation. Now here's something that blew my mind. I couldn't believe it even a little bit, and I looked at it and I was like, oh my goodness, this is very unbelievable. So let me describe this. So what I also did is I asked people, rate me your confusion about your position, where you think you are. Where 0 is I'm not confused at all, and 10 is I have no idea where I am in space. So this is the control group, and on Earth they have pretty low ratings, and by the time you get to 0G, they're like, I have absolutely no idea where I am. This is very confusing, stuff like that. Now here's the question. With the vibrotactile group, what do you think would happen? We see that the vibrotactors improve performance, so my assumption was, well, it must be improving their perception. I mean, after all, they're getting at all moments continuously information about where they are in their skin. So there really shouldn't be any confusion about their position. And yet, what I found was bananas, which is that, like, look at this. The vibrotactile group is just as confused as the control group about where they are in space. And really, what's happening here when you start talking to them is that what they feel like is they could swear they're in one location. Like, let's just say they may think that they're at 30 degrees. But in reality, they may be at negative 40 degrees. And the vibrotactors are like, no, actually, you're over here. And they go through a conflict, a perceptual conflict, a tug of war, a battle of like, what do I do? I was born with my vestibular system. This is what I rely upon since day one of my life. And all of a sudden, this isn't working. I keep losing control and crashing. What do I do? So this is an important finding that the vibrotactile group are not able to, that they don't correct your perception. And so this is another concluding point, that the vibrotactile feedback itself may introduce a feeling of conflict as G levels decrease. But they do help in performance. And surprisingly, this was same with velocity confusion when I asked them how fast you're going. And if you're interested later, I can talk more about this. But from the vestibular system, when I pitch people back, the information from their semicircular canals, which detect velocity, really shouldn't be any different. They really shouldn't be feeling confused at all, and yet they are. So anyways, I don't want to belabor this with all sorts of details, but if you're interested in that perspective, I'm happy to talk about it. So again, this was kind of interesting. Perception-wise, they're confused, but performance-wise, the vibrotactile group is kind of able to battle through their confusion and listen to their vibrotactors cognitively and still perform better, but not at the level of Earth. These kind of motivated future questions on, what do we need to do to get this kind of perceptual change? And is a perceptual change even important? Is it important to get rid of this confusion or not? Do you really want to hack into the human brain and correct these signals? It's maybe a philosophical question, but also, an interesting operational question. So I began to think though, like, well, how am I going to change perception? And I went into the sensory substitution literature, which is actually quite fascinating. I'd recommend you guys to read a review paper if you're not familiar with it. Back in the day, like decades ago, there was this researcher called Bakhirida. And his origin story is kind of interesting too, because he kind of, if I remember correctly, went into this path because his father got something in the brain, and I had to recover from it. So he began to think about neuroplasticity and what can you do. And his big sort of catchphrase was that you don't see with your eyes, you see with your brain. The idea being that you're processing visual information like in your visual cortex, and if you can get the same sensory information that your eyes are receiving through a different sensory system, like vibrations on the skin, in theory, through neuroplasticity, that can connect to your visual cortex and you can do visual-like processing. That was his idea. So some of the things that he did is he took like recently blind people, he'll put like a movie camera on them, and then that movie camera would send information to, for example, this little thing here. You put this on the tongue, it's a 12 by 12 grid, and it shocks your tongue. So if the movie camera, for example, sees an X, you get an X-shaped shock on your tongue. Or if you see a box in front of you, you'll get a rectangular shock on your tongue. And when people practice for hundreds of hours, I mean, it took a long time, they were able to detect or identify multiple objects. Some people were able to, these are, people who are actually blind, were able to catch balls. And a few people even reported the phenomena of being able to see again. Again, it's only 144 points, but that's what they said. So this was kind of phenomenal. It was kind of interesting. And a core part of the training of sensory substitution was this idea, and again, the reason to call it sensory substitution is if you don't have vision, you now replace it through tongue shocks or vibrations on your body. But a core part of this was that you needed to do free exploration. Have the camera explore, this way you create the mapping between the device and your sense of reality. And so the idea was like, okay, what if we put people for an extended time in the 0G analog condition? Will they be able to merge with this device? Will it be able to correct their perception? So very quickly, I'll run through this quickly. This is from my 2023 paper. And that's exactly what we did. We trained them on day one in the upright with the vibrotactors. And then on day two, for about 40 minutes, they're in the machine, just trying to balance. Just like the previous experiment I had described, people with the vibrotactors perform much better. But they were still not at Earth level. Even after being in that machine for 40 minutes, they're still crashing a lot, still having this conflict. 90% of people are saying, I don't know where I am, but I can use the vibrotactors, but I don't know where I am. And what was most perplexing was that they were in this machine for 40 minutes on day two, but they were not showing learning. They were better than the control group, but they just couldn't show sustained learning. They were just, as bad as they were in the beginning, that's how bad they were at the end. And so this was kind of perplexing. I'll talk more about this in a second. What was also kind of interesting was that people were reporting high levels of trust in the vibrotactor. So I'm like, man, you've got like really high level of trust. Some of these people will be like 95% trust that these vibrotactors are telling them where they are. I'm like, why aren't you relying on it? And this highlighted an important thing for sensory augmentation devices, but also perhaps for AI, for anything external to you, that cognitively, which is how people are assessing trust, you may be like, oh yeah, I trust this 100%. But then when it comes to actually relying on it in a disorienting condition, you may not be able to. And in some of my other papers, I talk about this idea of building a subcognitive trust. And that's different than your cognitive trust. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So again, part of the question here was, well, how do you bridge this gap between reliance and trust? And again, the sensory substitution literature had said do active sensing, but we did that. And as I began to think about it, what I realized is like what's different in my paradigm is that, in the sensory substitution, you'll take a person, you'll train them on Earth, right? And then you test them on Earth. But in our situation, we're training them in an Earth analog and then testing them in a spaceflight analog. So this is like you're going in, you have no intuition about this new world that you're going into. And once one of your sensory systems shuts off, it's hard to be able to transfer and generalize that learning. So what kind of training can we give them? And I came up with an idea based off of some prior studies that I had done. But again, I'll run through this very quickly. The basic idea was that maybe what we can do so that people really feel one with the vibrotactors is first put them in the Earth condition where they know. But then instead of having the balance point at the center, I'll hide it. Like in this case, the red line is the balance point. It's different than the gravitational vertical. It's hidden, this person, or I don't know where it is. So to find it, now what you have to do is disengage from your gravitational sense. You have to ignore your desire to align to upright while focusing on the vibrotactors. It's like creating a special bond with the vibrotactors. Once people are able to do that, then the theory is, which is which our study found, is that then people in the space-like condition on the back will be able to perform better. And that's what we found, that people performed a lot better once they got this specialized training. But they still reported conflict. So this improves performance. It allows people to learn in a disorienting 0G space-like condition, but it doesn't take care or correct of the perceptual conflict. It just teaches them how to overcome this conflict that's in their mind. So now coming back to the current study, the 2025 study that I've been going over, in the 0G analog condition, you need specialized training. But then we began to think, what about partial G conditions? Maybe, you don't need specialized training to really bond human and device together. Part of the motivation is that there were other studies, not done by us, done by other people, that were showing that vibrotactile feedback can kind of sharpen your senses if the sense is already kind of there. So like in one study by, for example, Marco Nardini, he had people with dulled visual senses, but then gave vibrotactile feedback on how far away a particular target was. And it kind of like a sharpening stone, sharpened their senses. So the 0G analog is sensory substitution. Your vestibular system is not providing what you need. You substitute it with the vibrotactors. But in Lunar-g, you have a little bit of gravitational information. So you're not replacing it. The idea is that you're augmenting it. You're sharpening it by providing vibrotactile feedback. So what we did is we brought a different group of people. They got 2 blocks in the Earth analog condition, 2 blocks of 5 trials, and then 4 blocks of 5 trials. Each were about 100 seconds long in the lunar analog. So we gave them a lot of time in the lunar analog to try to practice with the vibrotactors. Long story short, what we found is that extended practice in Lunar-g actually led to a lot of improvement in performance. In fact, it brought their performance back to Earth conditions, which we had not seen in the 0G condition. So this was really great. What this meant is that if you have vibrotactile feedback in a partial G environment, if you have enough time in that partial G environment, you'll be able to rely on them and likely bring your performance back to Earth conditions. Part of the concluding statement here is that if you're in a 0G environment, and you really need to do some sort, or like a micro G environment, you need to do some sort of like orientation task, you'll need some sort of specialized training, but in partial G, you just need extended time. Okay, but when we looked at the perceptual measurements, position confusion still remained elevated, even in Lunar-g. People are still confused. Even after 40 minutes of using the vibrotactors in Lunar-g, they're still confused. And so vibrotactors are not able to correct. They're not able to take the actual stream of data coming from your vestibular system and merge with it and correct it. They're not able to do that. However, interestingly, velocity confusion did go down. And I can talk more about that if you're interested. But the conclusion is that, vibrotactile feedback likely are not going to be able to correct positional perceptual conflict. So okay, let me come closer to my conclusions here. So partial G conditions will significantly increase susceptibility to spatial disorientation. Okay, and Martian-g, you've got a pretty good, this is just a third the size, a third G of Earth. So like you have a pretty good amount of gravitational information there, and even there, you're likely going to be very susceptible to spatial disorientation. And so that's one of the findings that we have. Of course, vibrotactile feedback will enhance performance even with minimal training. However, it's not going to be able to influence perception. And by that, I particularly mean positional confusion. In 0G, specialized training will be required that teaches one to disengage from their vestibular system while focusing on the vibrotactors. In partial G, you can get away with that. You don't really need to do that. Of course, it would help, but you don't need to. You can just have extended time in that partial G. The other kind of important point that the paper doesn't directly 100% prove, but kind of suggests, is that trust in a sensory augmentation device, or AI for that matter, does not necessarily mean reliance, especially in like fast-paced gut-level disorienting conditions. And the specialized training we did with this disengaging from your vestibular and focusing on your vibrotactile may be an example of how you develop a subcognitive trust to be able to do that. So I've done a lot of other work if you're interested. These are all published. In the space-like conditions, I've characterized performance and learning. That's what these 3 papers are over here. You've seen roll rotations, but I also do like, spinning motions as a funny, interesting side point. Well, maybe not funny, but intriguing side point. After I did these yaw rotation experiments, I met an interesting dance instructor who did pole dancing. And so I have a multidisciplinary Zoom session. I can always send it to you, that recording, where we looked at movements of pole dancers and also movements of yaw rotations to determine where you are in space, and then motion sickness. A third person talked about that. And then now I'm getting into like whirling dervishes who also dance and spin and are able to somehow overcome motion sickness. I wrote a grant, but it got rejected. But I think there's a lot of secrets there. Okay, and then the second set of things I look at is individual differences. I mean, I wasn't able to convey how huge of differences they are, but they're massive. There are people who, when they get disoriented, they only feel like they're 5 degrees away. Other people think they're completely 180 degrees away. It's astonishing. But some of these papers are on spatial acuity, trying to figure out where in space you are. Does your inner sense of that affect your performance? And then I've used machine learning to see like who's going to perform best. I looked at countermeasures. What can help when you're disoriented? So the training program, the specialized training program that I told you about, that's published. We used AI, deep learning, to see if we can predict when someone loses control. And I actually just, the asthma conference, that I presented that there. And then these 2 papers here are on vibrotactile feedback. And so there you go. And then, I do a lot of like artistic explorations. So for example, in the dance and human augmentation, as you may remember, people have this perceptual conflict of like, they don't feel one with this external thing, these vibrations. And so in my creative life, I'm exploring, what does one need to do to make yourself feel one with this device while in dance? So I'm getting a bunch of dancers. We create these little Arduino devices, and when one person tilts, the other person can feel it. But really the exploration is around ritual, because I do a lot of interesting ceremonial rituals. And the idea here is that storytelling, narrative, ritual, these things can make a person believe in some pretty unbelievable things. Can we tap into that psychological power to now make someone feel one with this external device? So those are some of the explorations that we're doing here. And then I do these like different events. I did one event on human augmentation, and different people talked about it. And then we did some like ceremonial stuff. And then recently I kind of looked at what does bringing AI into sacred spaces look like? And if any of you are near the Boston area, let me know. You're always welcome to come to my events. I love collaborating too. So, reach out either artistically or scientifically. All right, well, that's like pretty much the main presentation here. I don't have let me get out of this and see what time it is. Okay, looks like I'm pretty much on time here. Any